You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Yes, indeed. Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, the one and only Koku, here today to read another paper to you guys. I see we already have some activity in the chat room. Ogun is here, saying peace, everyone. Derico Cooper Photography is here, saying peace, family. The Revolutionary Matron from the Learning Curve podcast is here. And YouTube is already playing games where I have 0 viewers, but I just read to you 3 people who were in the chat room at the time. So, don't know what that's about. Well, I kind of do know what that's about. If you're here, make sure you hit the like button. Really appreciate it. The Pro-Black Perspective says peace. Peace to the Pro-Black Perspective. Right, so if you're here, hit the like button. Right, the fact that the Pro-Black Perspective just came on and said peace just tells you that concurrent viewers number is just bogus. But that's YouTube for you. Shout out to YouTube. So before I continue with reading this paper tonight, I want to remind you guys that this show is a part of a podcast network. There are other shows on the network you are invited to tune into.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron, on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure to check out all of those shows. KWAZ Radio. The Revolutionary Matron was on earlier, as she usually is, at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Make sure you guys are tuning in to her and the wonderful work that she's doing. Okay, make sure to tune into her and the wonderful work that she's doing. You know, tune into all of the shows on KWAZ Radio. So tonight's paper is on Sub-Saharan Africa and the economics of the region. I thought it was appropriate considering the matron recently was reading Black Labor, White Wealth, Powernomics. Only to say from the Pro-Black Perspective was also talking about culture and the influence of economics on culture. So I thought, maybe I should do something kind of in line with that. If you guys can hear me, type 1 in the chat for me if you can hear me. Because of the situation with YouTube, I'm uncertain if I'm even broadcasting, to be honest. If you can hear me, type 1 in the chat. All right. So let's hit it. So this paper, How Sub-Saharan Africa Can Become a Stable Economic Region, written by KENNETH C UPSALL. All right. Emerging from the colonial system, another look at how Sub-Saharan Africa can become a stable economic region. The process of economic independence does not occur concurrently with the process of political independence. When a former colonial possession achieves political independence, their economy is still engaged in a colonial economic system. This is apparent nowhere more so than in Sub-Saharan Africa. The ability for the new state to transition from the colonial system to the current global capitalist system is a process of establishing institutions within the state to foster domestic growth and create economic stability for the state. In an effort to assist developing states transition from colonial to the global capitalist system, developed Western nations have used foreign aid to help feed the people, build infrastructure, and prop up the governments of emerging quote-unquote democracies. This kind of dependency, perpetuation, is no better for developing states than the colonial system they are attempting to remove themselves from. Indeed, aid is simply a proxy for colonial rule and does not carry a developing state in the proper direction toward established institutions and an economy successfully established in the global capitalist system. So we already see the leanings of this author where, you know, they are talking about capitalism, right? Which is another European economic product, right? So again, I'm gonna put it out here early. This paper is not going to suggest, per se, a new economic system for Sub-Saharan Africa to follow, or a new economic model for them to follow, but more of, you know, working within this Europeans' philosophies, right, and economies. So let's just keep that in mind. But there are some good points made in the paper all the same. Independence politically occurs with the sweep of a pen and a handshake at a ceremony. Most of these occurred for Sub-Saharan Africa during the 1950s and 60s. Since then, there have been few economic success stories involving a state's transition from colonial economies to a stable place on the global stage. Emmanuel Wallerstein and Niall Ferguson explain how a colonial system is based on dependency and exploitation of colonial resources. Robert Gilpin testifies how the successful state economy should not be based on resource exploitation and therefore subject to shifting commodity prices, but be an entity driven by the interests of the state, and as T.E. Gregory states, be reconciled with the welfare of the citizens. All right? Many believe that, so I see folks are typing 1 in the chat, so clearly I'm being heard, and those concurrent views are just not real. Right? To continue. Many believe that foreign aid is in the best interest of emerging African economies and governments. Dambisa Moyo, William Esterly, and Paul Collier believe the lack of stable government institutions, poor domestic policy toward development, and a misunderstanding about the continuing cycle of violence are all to blame for poor African growth over the last 6 decades. These misunderstandings about the strategic way forward for Africa from colonial to capitalist economies and liberal government systems creates a cycle of dependency, which keeps developed nations forcing money onto a problem which cannot be resolved through money alone. The structural nature, and so, you know, that last point is important, right? It's not about aid, right? It's not about throwing money at a problem, right? What we have to do is throw ourselves at the problem, right? This is not about throwing money at the problem. It's about throwing ourselves at the problem, but we first have to shore up or strengthen and empower ourselves, right? We have to throw ourselves at the problem. The structural nature of African failure to develop has been discussed and debated for as long as economic and government issues have plagued the region. Unfortunately, most of the prescriptions for success in Sub-Saharan Africa are too large and specific. As a result, there is little room for state-specific approaches to be utilized. Often the aid and growth plans distributed by developed states give little thought to actually fostering growth and sustainability of state institutions and economies. In order for Sub-Saharan Africa to successfully emerge from colonial economic systems and find a substantial and stable place in the global economy, the agriculture industry needs to establish the ability to feed the state's population. Government institutions need to be grown and education opportunities need to be improved. Only then will Africa be able to begin to process the transition from colonial possession to stable world state. Right? So this brings us to a section called colonial system, and a subsection called economic structure of colonial systems. Built by governments and companies to extract resources and capital, European empires of the 18th and 19th centuries were economic machines, moving profits and materials back to the imperial center, creating increased wealth and therefore economic power for the empire. That's all that setup was. That's all colonialism is. All right? This extraction of resources and capital occurred first because of a need to perpetuate European conflict. Wars cost money, and European monarchs required new flows of capital to continue ongoing territorial and dynastic conflicts on the continent. At some point, these conflicts spilled over to the growing empires themselves. The 7 Years' War in Europe was a conflict not so much over European territory or perceived continental power, but about world colonial systems and therefore European economies, which affected those empires' ability to perpetuate conflicts. Imagine that. This is where we are as a people, right? This is where we are as a people. We are just fodder for their bullshit, right? Colonial expansion by European powers was a purely economic exercise, from a slave trade, which fueled economic development in the Western Hemisphere, to diamond and oil extraction in the 19th and 20th centuries. Africa has been part of a colonial system with the sole purpose of resource exploitation and the strengthening of someone else's economy. David Livingstone, known for his missionary work in Africa and throughout the British Empire, championed not only Christianity for Africa, but also commercial development. Quote, by encouraging the native propensity for trade, the advantages that might be derived in a commercial point of view are incalculable, as cited in Ferguson 2002. Through economic development of colonies, the imperial government was enriching itself, usually at the expense of the colony. Here's a question I have for you guys listening to my voice right now. Had Europe not dominated the African continent, what do you think the world would look like today? Had Europe not dominated the African continent ever, what do you think the world would look like today? Right? Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Absolutely. Them Chakas here saying we in here, saying peace. Right? The matron, the revolutionary matron, the Rev, is saying make sure, hit the like button. Much appreciated. But that's a serious question. What do you think the world would look like if we could close our eyes and dream it up? If you close your eyes and dream it up, what would the world look like today, in your opinion, had Africans, the continent, not been dominated by the European? Right? To continue, the results of colonial economic systems are described by Emmanuel Wallerstein as the world capitalist system. The economic development is designed to benefit a core group of wealthy industrialized states at the expense of resource-producing states, or, in this case, colonies. Wallerstein's idea of a core, semi-periphery, and periphery working in a single world system, quote, with a single division of labor and multiple cultural systems, is an excellent example of how the colonial system worked in Africa. The sub-Saharan economies are based on extraction and exploitation of resources destined for other areas. Wallerstein's world system, like colonial models, is stagnant in that it does not allow for development and movement from periphery to core status. In fact, the goal of colonial systems is an incredibly slow development, if any at all, of the colony in order to extract as much as possible over a long period of time as possible. Right? So this stuff should be kind of, fundamental to your understanding now. But we're building up to the point, right? The development of colonies is not an altruistic endeavor for the benefit of the colony, but the development imperial ability to extract resources from the colony. During colonial development, there is little infrastructure growth which is not tied to the maximization of profits for the imperial government. This can be seen in the development of transportation networks and industry in colonial possessions. While agriculture may be developed to a certain extent, its maximum ability to grow is determined by the subsistence necessary for resource extraction. That is, the growth of agricultural industries and colonies is in order to support the more profitable resource extraction rather than to develop a food supply designed for population growth and sustainment. Transportation networks are developed in the same way. Once resources are discovered, the goal is to move those resources where they will profit the empire most. As a result, most transportation networks in emerging nations are designed almost as an outward conveyor because of the movement of resources away from the colony or periphery toward the imperial center or core was paramount to profitability. I think it was on the Pan-African discussion, the Discord Pan-African discussion. If I remember, they had an image of like railways in Africa. And you can see how pathetic it is. And if you didn't understand why, this is why, right? There is a belief that the geography of Africa was almost a detriment to the development of a stable economy during the colonial period, and that the lack of development because of geographic and climate factors continues present. Daron Acemoglu sees the lack of institutional development in sub-Saharan Africa as a result of geographic factors, citing the disparity in per capita income between sub-Saharan Africa and the United States. Acemoglu feels that Europeans settled in North America not only for economic gain, but because the climate was hospitable for settlement, where African climate did not suit European tastes. It was left mostly for economic exploitation. Acemoglu argues, quote, Europeans set up exclusively extractive institutions, exemplified by the Belgian colonization of the Congo, slave plantations in the Caribbean, and forced labor systems in the mines of Central America, end of quote. Because these areas were not as suited to settlement as the societies which often improved on European institutions. In places like Australia, New Zealand, North America, etc. This lack of institutional creation based on geography is also due to a lack of time and funds. North American, Indian, and Oceania colonies were under European control for a significantly longer amount of time than their African counterparts. The partition of Africa beginning in the late 19th century would, quote, within 20 short years, and of course, transform 10,000 African tribal kingdoms into just 40 states. The partition of Africa beginning in the late 19th century would within 20 short years, 20 years, transform 10,000 African tribal kingdoms into just 40 states and create a culture of resource exploitation for the purposes of imperial strengthening unparalleled in global history. The result was a lack of investment in Africa, especially on the part of the British, who control roughly 1/3 of the continent, but only had 13% of foreign investment devoted to the entire continent, with hardly anything invested in the new African acquisitions of the scramble. The lack of investment in Africa was a problem which would have serious consequences for the region when colonial independence was gained just over half a century after its partition by European powers. This brings us to a section called Perpetuation of Colonial Systems Through Aid. Right? In the chat room, the revolutionary matron says, not quite the opposite of today. She's answered my earlier question. Not quite the opposite of today, but we would have more unity and there would have been more balance and justice in the world, provided we were able to work out our issues. Well, one thing that's for sure is, you know, Africa and Africans became a unifying force, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke used to say, for the Europeans. And we talk about that in the show all the time. All the infighting that they were doing, they weren't able to conquer Africa. They would probably be in a third and fourth Dark Ages. If Africa was left untouched, Africa would have had its faculties for innovation. It would have had the leisure of innovating itself, right? And so we would see something, I think, you know, not to be Wakandian, but we would have seen something serious from Africa had it been left alone, right? We would have been able to develop on our own, right? So that's the shame of it, really, right? That's really the shame of it. But I'd like to hear others' opinions as well. You guys, let me know, what do you think? What would Africa, what would the African look like today had we never been dominated by these colonial powers? So this section is the perpetuation of colonial systems through aid. The colonial system is currently perpetuated by foreign aid from developed and industrialized nations. In order for African states to be successfully integrated into the world economy, the developed states of the world need to rethink the best way to transition African states from foreign dependency of the colonial system to economic independence and stability as a member of the global economic community. According to Fareed Zakaria, there is no simple answer to why certain societies succeed at certain times. The ultimate goal is to give Sub-Saharan Africa a better chance of success than previously offered. The following section will begin to outline what has not worked for African development and frame future strategies which may lead to successful transition from a colonial system to global economic success for Africa. Since the beginning of the era of African independence, roughly 60 years ago, over $1 trillion have been transferred from developed and industrialized states to Africa. According to Dambisa Moyo, this massive capital transfer has not made Africa any better off or more developed than it was when the colonial system ceased existing politically. One reason for this is because the money that Africa has received has been used largely to perpetuate the colonial economic system. Economic independence takes much longer to take root than the relatively speedy process of political independence. In the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, the economic independence is lagging 6 decades behind. Poverty is a major reason Africa has not been able to achieve economic success over the last half century. Like many problems in Africa, this is cyclic. People are poor because the economy is poor. The economy is poor because the people are poor. Sub-Saharan Africa has some 50% of the world's poor, and Africa's real per capita income today is lower than in the 1970s. The altruistic solution from developed has been to give incredible amounts of foreign aid to African states. These influxes of capital have been targeted at a variety of different sectors, including disease prevention, education improvement, as well as financial and government institutions. Unfortunately, a World Bank study found that as much as 85% of aid flows were used for purposes other than that for which they were initially intended. Corruption, therefore, becomes another major reason for continued African poverty. Corruption, like poverty, is cyclical, as well as economic instruction. Paul Collier asserts that civil wars in sub-Saharan Africa are perpetuated by economic forces as opposed to ethnic ones. This belief highlights the cyclic and economic nature of African corruption and demonstrates the difficulty faced by post-colonial states. Because ruling governments control the economics of state, those in power shift economic gains, capital inflows, including aid, and weapons to the people and groups which will best support their cause and help them to retain power. If there is one picture of African statesmen, it is one of rank corruption on a stupendous scale. That's a quote from Moyo in 2009. When developed states continue to funnel aid into the corrupt governments of Africa, the leaders have little incentive to improve the economic situation of the state beyond being eligible for the next round of aid. Kings and bureaucrats wanted to stay in power and increase their personal gain constantly. That's a quote from Wallerstein, 1974. Moyo points to an incredible pressure by international organizations like the IMF and World Bank to continue the cycle of lending to impoverished nations that it leads to a seesaw effect, which will inevitably I think that means in favor of the corrupt government. Right? They put I, but it's in. In effect, the corrupt government is being rewarded for its failure. That's an important point. The corrupt government is being rewarded for its failure to bring the state out of colonial dependency with increased amounts of aid. Right? If a government is able to control not only the aid which a state received, but the return on exports the state produces, there's little incentive for the government, whether representative of any ethnic group, to cede power or work toward an improved economic situation of the state as a whole. How do you deal with how do you punish the folks that punish the folks? How do you punish the folks that punish the folks? How do you punish these corrupt leaders who someone pointed out on Twitter the other day? It seems like half of them are all misogynists too, by the way. How do you deal with them? Keeping in mind that it's their corruption and their payment for their corruption that allows them to throw this aid towards the groups, the rebel groups and whatnot, right? To throw the ammunition and weaponry behind those groups that support them. How do you tackle that? We talk about education, that's cool, that's great. But in a place that the people are keeping poor, where you could throw the poor some of this foreign aid money, some of that money to buy the weapons, to give them guns and ammo and whatnot, and empower them in that way. How do you punish that behavior, right, that punishes the whole continent. The problem is so multifaceted that we have to have a multifaceted approach as well. We can talk about education, that's fundamental. But we gotta talk about economics. We gotta talk about culture. We even have to talk about morality. Right? How do we get around that? Right? The Revolutionary Matron says, directed at colonial endeavors, health, education, and state administration. Directed at colonial endeavors, health, education, state administration. Right? That's from the paper. Right? But that's some food for thought. You know, you guys can post your ideas on how you think you get around that. You know, how do you get around it? If a government is able to control not only the aid which a state receives, but the return on exports the state produces, there's little incentive for the government, whether representative of any ethnic group, to cede power or work toward an improved economic situation of the state as a whole. How do you get around that? The open-ended nature of developmental aid also perpetuates an increasingly hopeless situation for many African states. Due to corruption and mismanagement of aid flows, the top quarter of aid recipients, heavily overlapping with Africa, receive 17% of their GDP in aid. It also had near zero per capita growth. Think about that, what that means. This means that money is continuously flowing into Africa with little to show, save governments which are mismanaging or simply stealing the money. All right? How do you deal with that? Right? What are we left to do now? Are we left to create some supercontinental, super Pan-African army and go in these places and wage war and stamp out the bad behavior? What do we do? What do we do? Moyo sees this perpetuation of the aid culture as the single most important aspect keeping African states from succeeding in economic development. While proponents of aid use the U.S. Marshall Plan at the end of World War II as an example of how development aid can rebuild a state and establish a strong economic engine which enhances the global capitalist system, Moyo points to the fact that the Marshall Plan was much better designed and executed when compared to African developmental aid. In contrast to the Marshall Plan's short, sharp injection of cash, much of Africa has received and have received aid continually for at least 50 years. Where the Marshall Plan had a stated and quantifiable goal of rebuilding European infrastructure and infusing capital into a broken economic system, African development aid is propping up a broken system and perpetuating colonial habits of weak state government and economies based on a system that does not foster state growth. We hear about it all the time, how like France still gets money, right, from former colonies on the continent to this day. Now the simple easy plan will be for those former colonies to refuse to continue paying. But like I've talked about in the past, there will be a fight on their hands for doing so. How do we get around this situation? The matron says in the chat, you have to purge it from the root. Model morals, give the people a profit motive, initiate worker co-ops from the outside in, remove government as the capital middleman. You have to purge it from the root. Model morals, give the people a profit motive. Initiate worker co-ops from the outside in. Remove government to capital middleman. Something to think about. All right. If anyone else here has ideas as well, and thanks to the matron for that, that's something to chew on. You know, post your thoughts as well, because it's through conversation. Right? There's something to be said about conversation. There's obviously something to be said about action. Right? But conversation can precede action. We got to start talking. There's no dumb idea per se. Just talk about it. Unless the idea is bring China in to help, you know, to help these continental countries. But other than that, let's talk. Let's throw out ideas. Little threads can become bigger things, right? Let's talk about it. Most colonial possessions, as previously discussed, were created with the purpose of settlement or resource extraction. Once the political independence of colonial states was granted, the economy of the former colonies was still structured on resource extraction. The underlying colonial economic system had been removed, but the standard execution of domestic economic action remained. Newly independent African colonies had domestic economies based on an economic system they were no longer a part of. The transition from colonial economic system to global capitalist system was something that few states were prepared for upon independence. Wallerstein sees this as the perpetuation of the world capital system. Even in independence, colonial states were still structured to offer cheap natural resources to the core states. Continuing in this system proved political independence these states had achieved was indeed very shallow. Why were these states simply unable to gain economic traction in a world system by continuing to sell resources to the highest bidder? In a capitalist system, the demand of resources should work to the advantage of the supplier and allow the supplier to profit. This cannot occur until the mercantilist policies of the colonial economic system have been removed in favor of more liberal trade practices. Okay. So we reached a section of the paper called Transitioning Away from the Colonial System. Transitioning away from the colonial system. The subsection is Economic Nationalism through a strong agricultural industry. Economic nationalism through a strong agricultural industry. We got KW Don 7 in the room. KW Don 7 says, no one who engages in miscegenation should be a leader of an African country. I agree. I agree. I think most of us would agree, right? The Revolutionary Matrix said to KW Don 7, 100. Well, actually, I meant to do this the other day too. Yes. Right? I agree. All right. To continue. Belief that a state can quickly transition an economy to one which is not only capitalist, but stable and successful is slightly absurd. There were decades of development for the British, United States, and Chinese economies before they became the juggernaut studied today for developmental answers. It could in fact be argued that the Chinese economy has not yet reached its prime, or that the U.S. economy is not in total decline, but merely a temporary downturn. The economies of these states developed through a progression from agrarian to industrial and with nationalist policies to aid in their growth. So I agree with much of that last statement. But agrarian, right? Who was the agrarian? In fact, who was the free agrarian? Or the agrarian for nothing, right? That's a problem I have with some of these papers sometimes. But I digress. They do not simply become a purely capitalist economy overnight, nor are they such today. Therefore, it is very difficult to assert that sub-Saharan African states should suddenly adopt purely liberal capitalist institutions and economic policies as a means to lifting themselves from the colonial economic system. Developing a national economy which benefits the state and eventually provides a foundation for a capitalist economy capable of stability, success, and belonging in the global system should have its roots in an agricultural economy. W. Arthur Lewis believes that periphery colonies have precipitated their own economic downfall by trying to industrialize before establishing a proper agricultural base. When African states gained independence in the latter half of the 20th century, it was the prevailing belief that in order to be economically successful, they had to immediately create industry which would be able to compete in the global system. Fortunately, this did not follow the successful model of creating an economy capable of sustaining the population of the state first. What do you guys feel about that statement? What do you guys feel about that statement? All right, KW Don expands upon his statement, which is 100%, I'm in agreement with this 100%. He says, to continue his previous thought, which no one who engages in miscegenation should be a leader of an African country. It is bad optically. It fuels self-hate. It just doesn't look good. That's what your children now are coming up looking at, right? The leader of the coup in Guinea has a Urugu female as a wife. Yeah, that's what people were pointing out on Twitter the last couple of days here about all, it started because of him, because of that leader in the coup, and then other people start attaching all the other miscegenants. The pro-black perspective is still here. He says pretty much what I said: get food first. Get food first. In order for African states to emulate a sustainable economic model, they first need to be able to provide food for their citizens. Jonathan Scheffler, in 1998 asserts that Adam Smith held that a nation's wealth lies first in agriculture to supply its people with ample food, second in domestic industry. The simplest way to accomplish this is to begin to transition from colonial to global economic system by creating a form of economic nationalism designed to improve the agricultural ability of the state. T.E. Gregory defines economic nationalism as the duty of the state to foster the economic power of the state rather than the economic welfare of the individuals. Therefore, policies which further the economic power of the state are also policies which further the economic welfare of the individuals. Because in democratic societies, reconciling the welfare of the individual with the welfare of the state leads to economic success. They are one and the same, right? So let me read that again, just to make sure I have that. T.E. Gregory defines economic nationalism as the duty of the state to foster the economic power of the state rather than the economic welfare of the individuals. Therefore, policies which further the economic power of the state are also policies which further the economic welfare of the individuals. Because in democratic societies, reconciling the welfare of the individual with the welfare of the state leads to economic success. They are one and the same. So let's go back quickly to the notion of communalism, right? Where it's about the group over the individual. You take care of the group, the individual will be taken care of. So in African societies that were agriculturally based, before encountering these Europeans, right? What happened? I mean, of course, they were educated by the colonizer with the colonial education example. But how is it that no one, right, has that African memory to say, hey, forget about what you're talking about. We're continuing the colonizers' economies. Let's go back to what we were doing before successful. At least in that way, we were able to take care of the welfare of our people. Right? What happened there? Right? Now, again, I mean, the paper kind of clues you in. The leadership sold out the continent. But you mean to tell me there's no one left who has this memory, so to speak, right, of the time when Africa was able to take care of everyone based upon this, this agricultural model? I'd like to hear what you guys who are live with me think about it. And if you listen to the playback, you can leave your comments. I encourage those comments. M.B. Gleave and W.B. Morgan compare African economies in order to find success and a pattern of stability. One of their findings is particularly telling about the need for a better agricultural industry in developing African states. In 6 economies, agriculture contributed more than 50% of GDP, while in another 5, it made the single largest contribution. Overall, the mean percentage of agriculture in 1965 for 27 national economies was 39.2%. In comparison, according to the CIA World Factbook, agriculture in United States makes up 1.2% of GDP. The ability of the U.S. to move itself from subsistence to agriculture in the middle of the late 19th century opened the door for industrial and service growth translated into a strong and stable economy. If African states can manage to feed their citizens while using a smaller portion of GDP to do so, farmers will see increased profits and opportunities for those not engaged in subsistence farming will create more profitability in other sections of the economy. So let me read that again. If African states can manage to feed their citizens while using a smaller portion of GDP to do so, farmers will see increased profits and opportunities for those not engaged in subsistence farming will create more profitability in other sectors of the economy. For those of you who are here with me live, what's across the continent, what's the #1 cash crop across the continent? So we're not talking about any specific area, but what do we find to be the leading cash crop? Is it still groundnuts and all that stuff? What's the #1 cash crop in the continent? KW Don 7 says food security should be the #1 priority continent-wide because it would offset the effects of transactions that would happen once we take back our land and resources. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. The pro-Black perspective has been talking about that too. The truth of the matter is, if you want to get these folks up off of you, you need to be able to secure food for your populations, right? If not, you're gonna have to go back begging these mofos, so to speak, to come and help you again, right? But again, we have a leadership problem on the continent, and I'm asking that question. How do you get rid of these leaders on the continent who have armed militias and militaries behind them? How do we get that problem out of the way? And who are also being funded by the Western powers? How do we get those folks up out of it? Right? The pro-black perspective says whoever feeds you leads you. You know? Whoever feeds you leads you. You know? This is why they have those old sayings like, you know, teach a man to fish, right? As opposed to giving him a fish, right? Because if I have to come and wait for you to give me, you basically control me. You control my time. If I could take up my tools and go and gather fish myself, you know, I'm my own man. Tito District. I don't think I've ever, have I seen Tito District here before? I assume Tito District has been here before, or maybe he or she just subscribed. It says, if you read George Ayete in Indigenous African Institutions, he uses Botswana as a model of the traditional agrarian society. There are also some villages doing this on the local level. Tito goes on to say, I just watched a seminar of a number of Cameroonian agrarian companies that are working to make Cameroon and other African countries food secure. Tito, do you know what's the big crop in Cameroon? Right? Oh, Tito says it's a she. My bad. My apologies, Tito. She says, I've been in the bushes watching, but it's my first time commenting. Oh, you're one of those folks, huh? In the bushes watching. All right. Make me call the police on you. To continue. Right? So, yeah, if you guys don't mind, you could always post facts into the chat as well. Like, you might not be able to post links per se, but you could post, you know, what's the big crop? What's the big staple food and the big crop in the continent? I'd like to understand that a little bit. Of course, I can look it up, and I will look it up, but you guys can post it in the meantime as well. So this brings us to a section called Developing Natural Resources for State Gain. Developing natural resources for state gain. Before I read that section, let me do a quick station ID break.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
By the way, if you or someone you know who's a small YouTube podcaster already, but they cover areas like, you know, empowerment, Pan-Africanism, Gaviism, etc. Let them know that KWAZ Radio is looking to expand and add more shows to the lineup.
Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
What are you going to do? What are you going to do? So, guys, make sure that you are subscribed to my social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc. Make sure you are on the Discord. The link is down in the description of this episode. On Saturday, time really flies. I just realized today, on Saturday, September 11th, we're doing the Solution Summit. It's going to be a discussion of all the hosts from KWAZ Radio as well as others. You're going to want to tune into that. You're going to want to tune into that. I believe we're going to be doing that on the Learning Curve podcast. So you're going to want to tune into that. Make sure you subscribed to the Learning Curve podcast channel here on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe, click the bell to be notified. If you're on the Discord, you'll be notified. If you're following me and the rest of the folks on social media, you'll be notified. Don't miss it. It's going to be a good time. All right? It's going to be a good time, so don't miss it. Tito Districts, she says, sweet potato, flour, plantain flour, cowpea or chickpea flour, cassava flour, etc. That was from one of the company's websites. I appreciate that. You know, there's a movement, like a business movement, where you could get involved in like some type of chickpea business on the continent, as well as like CMOS businesses. If I get more information, someone was putting me on to that a little while ago. If I get more information, I'll pass that along to you guys. But we got to start getting into some endeavors on the continent as well, right? We can't just keep talking about the continent. We got to get immersed in some endeavors on the continent itself. So this brings me to this part of the paper called Developing Natural Resources. By the way, thank you to Tito. Thank you to Tito District for that information. And thanks for jumping on today and actually commenting in the chat room. You know, the shows are much better when we have more people having a discourse with us. As the agricultural base of the state economy is being developed, geographic resources, which result in the second tier of the economy, trade and manufacturing, should be developed and improved upon. In most colonial cases, the extraction of natural resources is more developed than the agriculture of the state. This is a residual effect of the colonial system's reliance on the resource movement back to the imperial center. Robert Gilpin believes that the geographic location of a society and the physical requirements of the economy are of great importance in determining the national interests. Based on the wide range of available natural resources in the Sub-Saharan region, it is therefore understandable that the national interests of one state would be significantly different from others. Understanding the availability of natural resources is a key to understanding what kinds of industries needs to be established or emphasized once an agricultural base has been established. You know, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking about Cabral. And I'm thinking about how in depth that brother went into understanding the soil, right? In his country, right? Like, this is what we supposed to be able to pull this information up like that. And if you're on the Discord, you know, that's something that we can create as an initiative. Let's start really collecting all this information and simplify it so that you could quickly reference it. I know the pro-black perspective was doing something, but I think that was for political organizations on the continent. But even that, all of that needs to be put together, right? So if you wanna do something like that, if that sounds like some black work you would like to do, you know, join the Discord, hit me up in the DM and let me know. Tito District says agribusiness. Yeah, we have to really start getting into that a little bit more. Tito District says, you're welcome and thank you for the wonderful presentations you do. I appreciate the kind words. The check is in the mail, all right? To continue. Paul Collier states, Africa is land abundant, yet low income. Natural resource endowments loom much larger in its fortunes than for any other region except the Middle East. In Africa, Geography and Growth, he breaks down 4 categories of African state resource-rich coastal he breaks down, in Africa, Geography and Growth, he breaks down 4 categories of African state. Okay, that's why I went wrong. Resource-rich coastal, resource-scarce coastal, resource-rich landlocked, and resource-scarce landlocked. I actually like that. Resource-rich states pose the greatest problems for Africa because of the abundance of resources in these states. The ability for a ruler or government to hold power is greatly increased, especially if the government is democratic in nature. Collier, in fact, points to democratic governments which are easily corruptible because of resource abundance. Increasing and stabilizing resource and commodity prices are in the interest of these states in order to create stability in the domestic economy. A state that can have a successful agricultural industry coupled with a steady commodity trade is in a much more stable position than a state that has to rely simply on resource exports in order to create capital to purchase food for its citizens. Let me read that sentence again. Right? A state that can have a successful agricultural industry coupled with a steady commodity trade is in a much more stable position than a state which has to rely simply on resource exports in order to create capital to purchase food for its citizens. I since I was a kid home, I couldn't understand, even in my own hometown, I couldn't understand the import of food. I just couldn't get it. When we have, if you know where I'm from, we have all these islands. In other words, all this land, right, that's farmable. And the government won't create any initiatives to get the youth down in some of these southerly islands where I'm from, right, to develop agriculture. It's wild, right? Collier also points to resource scarce states in Africa as being part of an unusual problem that never developed elsewhere in the world the same way it did in Africa. Outside Africa, areas with these poor endowments seldom become independent countries. Rather, they become the hinterlands of countries that are overall more fortunately endowed. I get his point there. I've talked about that before too. Africa has just too many goddamn countries, if we're keeping it real. And Africa really needs Africa's creators, which we are as well, right? We are its creations and we are to be its creator. Africa's creators really need to consider that federation model, right? right? Where you have some of these countries, especially some of those landlocked countries that have nothing much going on. But it's time for y'all to go and be drawn into a larger country, right? This problem with resource-scarce states returns to the issue with colonial development in favor of the empire as opposed to the colony, because there was no reason for the development of these resource-scarce areas. They were greatly neglected and became dependent on outside sources for their continued existence. Can you guys in the chat identify for me examples of these resource-scarce states that we currently have on the continent? Drop some names of resource-scarce states on the continent, and don't be bashful to include countries you think need to be subsumed by other countries, right? The cultures perpetuated contemporarily in development aid and manifested in a continuously ineffective central government and economy. This brings us to a section called state-based development, subsection institutional growth for the benefit of the state. All right? Institutional growth for the benefit of the state. Tito District says Botswana is one of the resource-scarce states, and I think Chad is as well. All right? This is for the rest of the folks listening, and again, whether you're live with me on the playback, you could answer these questions. Are those the only ones you guys are aware of? Right? So institutional growth for the benefit of the state. By the way, you guys, make sure you hit the like button on the episode. Those likes actually mean something. If you're here listening from the bushes in the background, you too can still hit the like button. I appreciate it. And make sure to share the content too. If you know that you have some folks who like this type of content, share the content. As a matter of fact, I was talking to the Revolutionary Matron recently, and she was putting me on to lists, and I forgot that I actually kind of knew about it before. And I went on Twitter earlier today and looked up lists and found out like my Twitter is on a bunch of lists. And so in keeping with that kind of mindset, let's share the content, create lists, if you will, on your Twitter accounts or what have you. Share the content so people can know about what's going on at KWAZ Radio in particular, right? Like right now, I just saw the Pro-Black Perspective did a screenshot of the show and made a comment. I can't read it right now. Well, actually, I can. What am I talking about? He said, Bittermed's reading a paper on African economic development. Notice even Adam Smith, father of capitalism, says agriculture first. Go listen. This serious. Thank you for that too, by the way. You see, that's what I'm talking about, right? Share the content, you know? Share the content. Let others know what's going down here. It's an interesting and very important conversation to be having, right? So I appreciate that. The Pro-Black Perspective in the chat asks Tito, how is Ayate's book? He's been meaning to read it. In fact, you know, I meant to do this before. Let me make sure I got all the folks on KWAZ Radio are now moderators on my show as well. All right. So you guys can actually tag people and boot people if you have to. Okay. So institutional growth for the benefit of the state. The Washington Consensus was developed by John Williamson in 1989 to advise policy prescriptions which Williamson thought would not only create development in Latin American countries, but also held a consensus among Washington power brokers and economists. The result of this paper was a coalescing of economists and development aid enthusiasts who felt that by using the Washington Consensus as a roadmap to development, countries anywhere could be brought from the colonial economic system into the global capitalist system with relative ease and success. Right? This attempt at cookie-cutter reforms and policy outlines did not help in development and in fact continued to perpetuate the corruption and lack of development in sub-Saharan Africa because the institutions which would drive the Washington Consensus were not in place. Therefore, success was doomed from the beginning. You know what's wild to me? So this author is talking about this Washington Consensus, right? As if the folks involved in this consensus are not allies with the colonizers of the continent and the ones who are extracting the material resources from the continent. And what further kills me is, why would the colonizer want to develop a roadmap for the continent to become this so-called global, become a part of this so-called global capitalist system, as if that's not going to cut into their abilities to be capitalists? It's just, this shit is just mind-blowing. It's just mind-blowing. All right? But again, you have to understand what's going on here. You have to understand deception and why deception is being employed. All right? That's all this paragraph that's talked about the Washington Consensus, all that is deception. As opposed to the Washington Consensus, the following diagnosis and prescription is not a policy checklist to follow, but a tour guide of steps in a lengthy process, which may in some cases lead to success. Danny Roderick claimed rightly that the Washington Consensus was too wide in scope and had grown even wider over the 17 years between 1989 and 2006. He highlights the original Washington Consensus and the augmented consensus, which includes another 10 items as an example of how the concept of policy actions steps has grown out of control and become an encumbrance to lasting and successful reform. What has become clearer to practitioners of the Washington Consensus over time is that the standard policy reform did not produce lasting effects because they were too broad and offered little in the way of customization based on state needs. The reason for this was because underlying institutions were not effectively established to provide a foundation for consensus action to be successful. The lack of institutions, coupled with the inability of the Washington Consensus to be successful because of the boilerplate nature of the policy, highlights another cyclic problem with developing sub-Saharan Africa, that of being able to create a government capable of enacting and enforcing the reforms necessary to establish and foster economic growth. Williamson defends the consensus by stating most countries, quote, most countries would have benefited by doing more of these reforms rather than fewer, and by doing them of their own volition, rather than because someone from Washington tried to tell them they needed to be done. The answer to the ineffectiveness of the Washington Consensus is to make fewer points, not more. Roderick, again in 2006, believes that by giving emerging governments more freedom in policy formulation, it will give the state a better chance at success. There is a tendency to exaggerate the advantages of rules over discretion in government behavior. If the government of the developing state was allowed to create policy based on their national interests, a set of policy points developed on another continent in the vacuum of an already stable economy and government, the resulting nationalist approach would be suitably tailored to the state in question and would therefore stand a greater chance of success. And you know, that's the dastardliness of this foreign aid and the IMF and World Banks. When they give you that money, they give you that, when they give you that money, they give you that with some rules attached. In fact, the rules come first. You see what I'm saying? The rules come first. And those rules cover all major facets of African life. Chief among them is education. Chief among them is education. Revolutionary Matron says, why do they keep thinking that any non-African is going to solve African problems? Well, you see, that's the part of the game too, is deception again. Because outside of us here listening to this reading, and me doing this reading, right? Outside of us, those Africans who don't realize that you need to solve your own problems are going to read this paper and be like, yeah, these folks can come up with solutions to our problems. Okay, these folks had this Washington consensus. It was too broad, but maybe if they whittle it down a little bit, maybe it could work for us. And this is our problem. All of this stuff is for us to keep thinking that someone else is going to do this work and make it right. The Revolutionary Matron says all warfare is based on, drumroll, deception. Then she says, oh shucks, got my first wrench. I just made her a moderator for the show, right? In time, I envision there'll be a lot of folks in the chat room. Every moderator would be, everyone who has moderator status would be necessary, right? Institutional growth in this scenario is key to successful establishment of stable government and economy, protection of property rights, incentivizing farmers to produce food in quantity, which will sustain the population as a whole, and building of resource-based manufacturing domestically, 3 steps which will lead to economic stability. So what do you guys feel about that? I mean, we established the need for agriculture, and that your economy will be based on your agriculture, and you know, which is a part of your state needs, right? The ability to feed your people, right? Protection of property rights makes sense. It follows, right? Farmers should be able to have their property protected. Incentivizing farmers to produce food in quantity that will sustain the population as a whole is also sensible. Now the question is, how do you go about incentivizing that behavior? Is it just through some type of money consciousness, like the matron says? Or is there something else? And that's something else, by the way, the incentivizing of African people. When we talk about economics, that's the thing that we really got to tackle. That's the thing that we really have to tackle when we talk about economics, right? Because you want to incentivize farmers to farm, or else they're going to go use the land for something else. How do you incentivize them? So you guys give me some ideas on how you think you incentivize farmers to not only farm, but farm in the quantities that will allow you to feed your whole population. And the last one was building of resource-based manufacturing domestically, right? Building of resource-based manufacturing domestically. These domestic initiatives work in parallel with the developmental educational opportunities will allow for a stable government capable of protecting citizens' rights and creating the groundwork for stable democratic growth in government. All right? You guys, let me know how you feel about that last paragraph there. Property rights and incentives for farmer production work hand in hand to create the economic base necessary for self-sufficiency as an independent state. Property is taxable. If a farmer owning land needs to pay taxes, the easiest way to do that is to create and sell product. In order to pay taxes and earn enough money to support the business and his family, a farmer almost immediately needs to move beyond subsistence farming into a more productive business-driven model. It is unfortunate that some farmers will not be able to make this transition. But these men and their families should not starve if others are successful at creating the agricultural base which can supply the entire state with food. A noted problem with this approach is the ability of farmers and the government to be less sensitive to price shifts. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that sensitivity to price shifts, that's the capitalist problem, so to speak. Right? We have to find another way around that. Right? The Tito District says that is the most important part to consider in terms of building and growth is incentivized. Absolutely. Absolutely. The matron says we need that spiritual side and sense of community. We start off with the money thing, but we are educating them and their children at the same time and providing recreational activities. So the matron is saying the incentives could start off based on cash and then transition to education, right, and other recreational activities. Interesting. It's food for thought, right? Food for thought. Roger Thoreau in 2010 highlights the 2003 famine in Ethiopia and the global food crisis of 2008 as examples of situations where African farmers were destroyed economically. He also highlights that during the 2003 famine, the U.S. government spent more than $500 million on food aid. It spent less than $5 million on agricultural development. This broken system is what keeps African nations dependent on a colonial system. The developed, I think that means state, the developed state giving millions in food to a state which cannot provide for itself while spending a fraction of that money on attempting to develop an agricultural base capable of supporting the domestic population is not a sustainable model. Absolutely. Eventually, the developed states will run out of the money they can spend on others. When this happens, the developing states will still not be producing their own food. Right? It's, you know, it's a difficult situation. The fix is simple on paper, but where the fix needs to be applied, the environment for where the fix needs to be applied, that's really the obstacle. If we're keeping it real, that's really the big obstacle. You know, you guys tell me your thoughts on that statement, right? Investment in farming practices will create profits for farmers. Streamlining production will allow for higher profits and the ability to create a larger labor force. All right. You know, I'm kind of liking some of the game he's dropping here. This is possible because there will not be as large a need for labor in the agriculture sector. this new and mostly unemployed workforce can be shifted from agriculture to other industries based on state interests. Right? The ideal situation is that these workers will be making more than they would have farming, and therefore have not only more taxable income, but the ability to begin purchasing property. Given that property rights depend on the state, dramatic transformations in property often coincide with big political changes, right? Such changes are symbiotic with development of incentives for production, farming, and property rights. As the government is better able to empower its citizens, these political changes can come about in a more peaceful manner than if the government peruses the alternative, controlling aid flows and food supplies in order to control the population. This kind of action leads only to civil unrest, poor economic conditions, increased famine, and state destability. The result is a perpetuation of the colonial system and a failed state. Conversely, if the state is able to create an environment by which farmers and productive and profitable, the citizens of the state are then free to find better paying jobs, continue a cycle of increased profitability through development of other industries outside of agriculture. This would also drop the percentage of agriculture as a portion of GDP and increase the ability of the state to function outside of the colonial system. I gotta highlight all of that. I gotta research all of that. Effective government is the key. That is the next part of this paper, next section. Effective government is the key. What have we been lamenting this whole time? Right? The revolutionary matron in the chat says people will turn over their children if they think they have an opportunity for a better life. We can give them a community consciousness over time. The district, Tito District says to the learning curve with the revolutionary matron, I agree. That sounds like an effective strategy to start. The matron says the goal is for you to have to clean your teeth after the paper because you got meat at the meeting. The goal is for you to have to clean your teeth after the paper because you got meat at the meeting. She goes on to say you have so much information and your insights are valued and appreciated. Welcome. He's talking to Tito District. The matron says we must walk in as servants. The best leaders serve the people. Yeah, that's what the diaspora needs to do. Again, I've talked about this before. I'm not going to go through all of it, but get your skills together. Get your skills together. All right? Get your skills together and return to the continent with these skills. All right? Get your skills together. Return to the continent with these skills. Right? Problem solving is a skill. Right? Mechanical and repairing is a skill. Right? Interpersonal is a skill. Time management is a skill. Health and physical stamina is a skill. Right? Organizational, management, adaptability, all those things are skills. Right? Get your skills together. Humble yourself. Right? Stop thinking that you are the center of the world, that everyone follows you. Right? Get your skills together, return to the continent, and help build the continent. Africa awaits its creators, right? And we are Africa's creation. Tito District says to the learning curve, you do as well. The suggestions you are making, and I have also been thinking about in terms of possible solutions. Great minds smile. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed the paper tonight. Let's go through and finish this paper up. If you're still with me listening, if you enjoyed the reading so far, please type 1 in the chat. type 1 in the comment section. If you enjoyed the reading, give me a 1 so I know that, you know, we're winning. Right? So effective government is key. In order for Sub-Saharan Africa to truly break free of a colonial economic system, the previously discussed social institutions need to be in place. Property rights, agriculture incentives to make the state self-sufficient in food production and development of resources-based manufacturing in order to move the percentage of GDP in the direction of manufacturing and away from subsistence farming. These steps are difficult, time-consuming, full of potential snags along the way. This is where you have to be real about the situation, right? Making Africa an economically viable member of the global capitalist system is a lengthy process. These steps are just part of that process. None of the above-mentioned reforms can take place without strong government institutions. These are perhaps more important than the social and cultural change which brings economic reforms to maturity. Governments need to work for the betterment of the state. And as T.E. Gregory stated, reconciling the betterment of the individual leads to a betterment of the state. Democratic governments may not be the quickest and best answer to building strong state institutions. Easterly, Collier, and Moyo all agree that quick democratization of African governments has only led to trouble in the past. The answer, as Moyo puts it, may be for a benevolent dictator. Now, see, I was going to mention a dictator earlier when I was talking about how do we deal with these leaders and these governments. The problem is we've seen dictators on the continent. We've seen dictators on the continent, right? Well, let's talk about benevolent dictators a little bit, right? The answer is, as Moyo puts it, maybe for a benevolent dictator who is interested in state success instead of personal gain. Gertrude Daz in 2006, like Moyo, believes that democratic bureaucracy is a counterweight to efficient and quick economy growth. Speaking it in the context of Indian economic growth, Daz writes, quote, Indian believe that their bureaucracy has become a prime obstacle to development, end of quote. This sentiment is shared by Moyo. Quote, the uncomfortable truth is that far from being a prerequisite for economic growth, democracy can hamper development as democratic regimes find it difficult to push through economically beneficial legislation. How do you guys feel about the benevolent dictator? The need for democratic institutions for a successful capitalist economy is undeniable. Examples of how well state-centric economies function in the global capitalist system are evidenced by the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and African states which attempted state-planned or communist economies in the latter half of the 20th century. Okay. In order for democracy to succeed in Africa, though, there has to be a certain level of institutional strength in other areas. Robert Kaplan points to the necessity of at least primary education for democratic institutions to be successful. Quote, only in a society where most people can read, that has a sizable middle class that pays taxes, and reasonable institutions manned by literate bureaucrats, where people do not have to worry about being killed or attacked by their neighbors, that enjoys basic order, will democracy unleash all that is best in a society. You can't duck education, right? Truth be told, you just can't duck the education issue. You can't duck the education issue no more than you can duck the economic one. right? To continue. This statement brings into clear focus the economic reforms such as incentivizing farmers to feed the population and increase their profits, and judicial reforms such as property rights protection in order to defend the middle-class taxpayers, needed in order for sub-Saharan states to be economically successful. Instead of rapid democratization of African states, governments in those states should be strong and state-centered for the time being. We should think of democratic and autocratic systems of power as being simultaneously in play in many African countries. Strong states are destined to be better producers of democracy in the long run. Increase exposure to the rule of law through property rights reform, and increased profit from agriculture and resource-based trade and manufacturing will help the state to gain economic stability. Strong economic growth in sub-Saharan African states will lead to a more peaceful landscape in the region as well. Right? That's all a part of nation building. Simply put, economic growth matters because opportunities for youth depend upon a robust economy. Part of the current problem with African economics and civil unrest stems from the fact that the economy is so broken, there doesn't appear to be a way to fix it. Civil wars become a cyclic event, just like poverty, corruption, and institutional impotence. When popular upheavals occur, the pyramid is inverted. The corrupt rulers are suddenly fighting for their political and often physical lives against poverty-ridden and desperate rebels who simply wish for economic success. In order to end the cycle, reform must come from rulers and governments willing to buck the trend and understand that political and economic stability, not personal wealth, is the best way to hold on to power in the long run. Let me read that again. In order to end the cycle, reform must come from rulers and governments willing to buck the trend, understand that political and economic stability, not personal wealth, is the best way to hold on to power in the long run. Moyo points to simple statistics to make the claim that once economic reform is instituted and democratic institutions are in place, there is no greater substitute than democracy for stability. Democracy can be expected to last on an average of about 8.5 years in a country with a per capita income under $1,000 per month. 16 years in one with income between $1,000 and $2,000. 33 years between 2,000 and 4,000, and 100 years between 4,000 and 6,000. Above 6,000, democracies are impregnable. Right. The average per capita income of sub-Saharan Africa is currently $1,165 per year. According to the World Bank, if African rulers wish to stay in power, that's a typo on their part, wish to stay in power, economic empowerment of their citizens, not perpetuation of broken colonial systems, are the answer for stability. Bring the economy around, and institutional change in government will likely follow as education is improved and income increases for the citizens of the state. The last piece of the institutional puzzle ties every one of the previous subjects together. Education with agriculture, capable of sustaining a larger population with less direct labor. A growing percentage of the population will need to focus on other areas in order to make a living. By increasing primary and secondary education, sub-Saharan states can begin to build an even stronger foundation for their economic future. Increased education opportunities can start as simple endeavors such as retraining laborers to work in resource-based manufacturing, completion of primary education, or embarkation on secondary educational studies. Increased education will lead to innovations in the resource-based industries and help to build better government and social institutions. As Kaplan pointed out, an educated population is necessary for democracy to truly be effective. Increasing economic fortunes through agricultural and resource-based industries will increase the desirability of the population to continue on a positive track, which will result eventually in the kind of impregnable democratic governments. The work will be slow, but the amount of per capita income needed to truly stabilize Sub-Saharan Africa and bring it into the global capitalist system is relatively small compared to the amounts already spent in failed attempts to prop up a broken system. This brings me to the conclusion. Before I read the conclusion, let me pause for a final station ID break.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Check out all of those shows, KWAZ Radio. In the chat room, the Tito District and Revolutionary Matron are enjoying the paper. Thank you for your number ones. Tito District asks, is the Moyle being cited in the article Sam Moyle? I mentioned his full name earlier. I'll get back to you in a second with that. Tito also, she says, I think in certain countries, the benevolent dictator or autocrat can work like in China, but on the continent, it's been a failure so far. Yeah, it's been largely a failure so far. Tito, just a quick question. You say you usually lurk in the bushes. What brought you out of the bushes tonight? Thanks for your insights, too. I appreciate it. What brought you out of the bushes tonight? All right, so let's finish this paper while Tito answers that question. The past 60 years, I've seen Sub-Saharan Africa struggle to break out of a colonial economic system never designed to foster state growth. This system is based on resource extraction and creating imperial wealth. Once the African independence era began in earnest during the second half of the 20th century, the newly independent states began to have problems adjusting to their new status outside the colonial economic system. Economic independence by nature takes longer to establish itself than political independence. In Sub-Saharan Africa, developed states deposited enormous amounts of aid into the region in hopes of speeding the process along. Foreign aid for over 6 decades cost roughly $1 trillion and gave little evidence of economic improvement or sustainability. Poverty and corrupt governments continue to hold back the possibilities of economic stability in the region and perpetuated the colonial system. Establishment of a strong agricultural industry capable of providing food to a state's entire population is the first and most important step in economic stability for Sub-Saharan Africa. Profitability in the agricultural industry will allow for taxable property and income, which the state can use to increase revenues and invest in education for what will be an increasingly unemployed labor force as a move is made from subsistence agriculture being a large part of GDP to a more manageable amount, which will enable other sectors of the economy to develop. Resource trade and manufacturing will also need to be grown in order to break from the colonial system. Developing states need to use their resources to their advantage and not perpetuate civil war and poverty through an adherence to colonial economics. Increasing resource-based manufacturing, once a stable agricultural base is established, will greatly increase GDP and per capita income. Government institutions will also need reformation. Stronger property rights will expose developing states to a better economic system and rule of law-based culture. As taxable income increases, educational improvements will allow for better innovations in existing industries and create new opportunities for growth. Educational development would also lead to government growth and stabilization. Economic stability will allow for democratic institutions to take hold and remain in place across Sub-Saharan Africa, allowing for stability to return to the region as a whole, increasing the likelihood of further economic gains. The preceding are steps within the greater process of economic stability and governmental legitimacy for success in Sub-Saharan Africa. These steps are not chronological, nor are they applicable in all situations. The difference between failure and success is difficult to see, as evidenced by 6 decades of failed attempts. Colonial systems must be outgrown in favor of global ones. Governments must work for the betterment of the state and its citizens, not for the simple hold on power and wealth which has permeated the region since independence began. Above all, this is a process, not a golden egg. Therefore, the changes will take time. Eventually, economic stability and sustainability is within reach if the right combinations of steps is taken. Quick question for those of you who are still here with me. That's the end of the paper, by the way. If you're still with me, quick question. Who was the first corrupt African leader? Who was the first African leader straight up on the payroll, the quote-unquote payroll? Moyo is not Sam, it's D. Moyo. It's not Sam Moyo, it's D. Moyo. And I know I read the name earlier in the paper. It's just slipping me right now. I don't remember the first name. Right? But if you go through the playback, Tito, you'll catch the first name. But it's D. Moyo. Right? The matron says you must birth a dictator or have a nanny for Dessalines. KW Dawn 7 hit 1. I forgot now what I asked to hit 1 for. Tito says that I felt I had a bit of knowledge in the topic that I could contribute. I'm also really interested in this particular topic. Tito, if you haven't already, hop on the Discord. The link is in the description. Usually I have it pinned to the top of the chat. I didn't do it today. But hop on the Discord and hit me a DM. Talk to me. Let's talk about some initiative stuff here. Let's do some work. If this is an area you're interested in, then come on, let's talk. Let's do some work. Pro Black Perspective says good paper. I don't know who first corrupt leader was, but I heard Nkrumah was corrupt, as were the Liberians. All right. Tito says thank you. No problem. But I'm really interested in that. I too have heard that Nkrumah was corrupt and on the payroll, but I'd really like to know, who was that first asshole who showed their hand, right? I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, taking in this paper with us. I'm going to go through the list of people. It's a short list tonight. Ogun was here. I don't know where Ogun went, but Ogun was here. The Rico Cooper Photography was here as well. Of course, the Revolutionary Matron was here. Of course, the Pro-Black Perspective was here. They're always very supportive. They're my podcast mates on the KWAZ Radio Podcast Network. Really appreciate them. Mchaka was here, saying peace. Peace to Mchaka. Who else was here? KW Don 7, of course. The reliable KW Don 7 was here. We also had Tito District, of course, was here. I think that was the last person who came by. If I missed you, I didn't do it intentionally, right? So I apologize. Once again, Saturday, September 11th, Solutionary Summit. Make sure follow us on, follow me here, of course, subscribe, click the bell, follow on social media, right? Join the Discord. You'll be updated. Follow all the rest of the gang on KWAZ Radio, as well as follow the KWAZ Radio YouTube channel. You'll be updated. You'll know when we're doing the summit on Saturday, right? I invite all of you to come and tune in. It'll be all the hosts from KWAZ Radio, as well as a few other friendly folks will be there as well. Tito, you should come by. You should come by and check it out, right? So, next up is the Saturday Night Shoot the Breeze. Tomorrow will be the Revolutionary Matron at 6 o'clock in the PM, Eastern Standard Time. Make sure to tune in to her show as well. I'll be here for Shoot the Breeze. If you have topics for Shoot the Breeze, even though we have the Solutionary Summit, I think I'm still going to do a Shoot the Breeze that night. I have to push it back a little later, that's fine. If you have topics for the Shoot the Breeze, you know what to do. Post it on the Discord. Right? Until next time. Thank you. Thank you for being you. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.